So, Devil May Cry HD Collection came out a few weeks ago on PS4 and I bought it on day one with full knowledge that it would just be a generic HD port where nothing will have been changed. But I don't really care because I absolutely adore these games. In fact, after replaying them again, I think I adore them even more. These are actually games I can play without feeling the need to use a guide or without getting too frustrated or stuck at all, as you'll probably learn everything over time. I'm actually kind of awful with certain games and tend to fall back on a walkthrough a lot. Let's just say, even though I absolutely adore the Zelda games and I'm happy I was able to play them on the 3DS, I basically had to use a guide for almost the entire game. Yes, that might make me an uber scribbler, but that's just how I am. I honestly don't get how people figured out that kind of stuff on their own. Anyway, today we'll be ranking the DMC games, including the reboot, as all the games are now on PS4, which means I was able to capture them all and play it all, and I had an absolute blast doing so, for the most part. Remember, this is purely my opinion and I don't intend this to be an official list, this is just for a bit of fun. So anyway, let's start with number 5.
I'm absolutely crazy about it!
Devil May Cry in high definition.
At number 5 we've got DMC2. Yes, I like this game less than the reboot. Don't worry, we'll get onto that. But honestly, this game is actually kind of terrible. Not completely though, it's actually completely functional and there have been some advancements such as better evasion from the first game. But the combat, difficulty and Dante as a character have taken a serious nerfing. Everyone roasts the quote unquote new Dante from the reboot, but have you seen what he's like in this one? He just acts like he's become an old man who's bored of living and he's lost his wit. In fact, he barely speaks a word in this one. Yeah, I suppose it's better than being unbearably cheesy and an absolute loser into the reboot, we'll get onto that, but still, he was poorly handled in this one. The story basically involves stuff. Yeah, it's terrible. Like, you tend to skip the cutscenes a lot in this one. As for the combat, they nerfed the difficulty hard, which is the complete opposite of what this game is. And they made it into exactly the opposite of hard. The game was pathetically easy. And if you have ever played an action game before, or just finished playing the first game, you will fly through this one. Really, the only hard part is a bit towards the end where you have to find 4 orbs in a giant level, which can be annoying if you don't know where they are. Basically, enemies die after a few hits and you take no damage at all from them. And even though you get different swords, they don't have different movesets at all. The guns are different, I suppose, but they made it so you could basically play the whole game using guns only. The guns are too powerful in this one. In fact, I would say it would make the game harder, but some enemies are extremely bullet spongy and it becomes very boring. The whole point of the guns is to be used as filler between combos if you're a distance away from the enemy and want to maintain your ranking. But in this, it basically sends every enemy flying in the air. Also, the levels feature a ridiculous amount of running around empty space where nothing is happening. Not even to build atmosphere or anything, unlike the first game. It's just pointless running around. Are the bosses at least any good? No. They all take place in giant open arenas, and most of them don't even feature any long-range attacks that will hit you at a distance. One boss basically requires you to shoot it for 5 minutes and occasionally dodge a missile it fires at you. I'm surprised that it's actually not become a meme, that one, because it's so stupid and ridiculous. The game is also about the same length as DMC 1, but you will fly this one through. You will fly through this one a lot faster because it is so much easier than the first game. It took me about 2.5 hours to beat the entire game. There is a second disc with another character in different levels, yes, but her moveset is dull as well, and she doesn't even use guns. I did like one mission and got really bored and haven't. I did like one mission and got really bored and haven't touched it. That second campaign again. Really, the only thing I like about this game is the music, and occasionally the game can be kind of fun for about 5-second blasts or so. If you get the HD collection, then you won't miss anything if you skip this one. Coming in at number 4, we've got DMC, which is what I'm going to call it. D lowercase MC. Don't get me wrong, DMC is not terrible, but they just got so many things wrong with it in this reboot. They changed up the controls to make it more like God of War, something that's not really Devil May Cry. I suppose they kept triangle to attack and they kept the like delay combos, but that's really about it. They got Dante horribly wrong, which is why in the gameplay I'm using the DMC1 skin in the gameplay, which while cool doesn't actually change it in some of the cutscenes, so it can be a bit jarring sometimes. The music is, I don't know what they did with it. It's a completely different genre. Like, I don't know, there's probably some technical tones for it, what it's in the other games and what it is in this one, but the music is different and it doesn't really fit this kind of gameplay, to be honest with you. And the PSC, PS4, or PS3 even, and the 360 version of the game are too easy. It's too easy to get S ranks, it's too easy to get overpowered and completely annihilate bosses. It's just, yeah, it's overall just insultingly easy at times. I'm talking Devil May Cry 2 levels of easy. However, if you were to start with this one as your first DMC game, which you actually probably should now I think about it, you probably won't find this too bad. You probably won't mind the gameplay and you'll probably get along with it kind of well. You won't think it's amazing, but you'll like it. But after playing through Devil May Cry 3, I could not stand it, to be honest with you. Even with turbo mode, which speeds up the gameplay by 20%, and hardcore mode, which changes the whole ranking system and how much damage enemies do, the game is still too easy. Also, the game's lore and backstory is almost completely irrelevant to the other games. The only thing I liked upon my latest replay is the fact that they made it so Stinger sends enemies flying, so it's a bit unpractical to spam it, unlike DMC1, which we'll get onto. And the other thing is that you do get a pretty advanced moveset early on. By the second level, you've got 2 new weapons. So at that point, you're basically comboing quite a lot altogether. The game is also longer than the other games, but that's mainly because of these crappy platforming sections that kill the pace of the game, in my opinion. I personally hate them, and that's someone who doesn't like platforming. That's someone that doesn't get along with Mario or anything like that. It has some cool bosses in it, I suppose, but that's really about it. If you have never played DMC before, then I can recommend this one at a cheap price for one playthrough. Or maybe borrow it from a friend or something. If you play this after playing the other 4 games, it will rub you the wrong way, unless the only other game you played is 2. Then you'll think this is a complete masterpiece in comparison. If you do want this game though, get the PS4 version. It's definitely superior, even more superior than the PC version. There's not really much I could say other than it's 4th place. Let's just carry on with the video and talk about some better games for a change. Number 3 is DMC4. DMC4 is a fantastic game, but that's only because it has the legacy and combat engine of DMC. If this was not a DMC game with DMC and combat, then this would be remembered as a pretty terrible game. My first problem is you don't actually play as Dante for the first half of the game, and this new character actually has a pretty dull moveset to start with. You do get it upgraded as you go along, but it's pretty dull to start out with. Also, the levels at times can be very dull to navigate. They're very basic, they don't really go full on out there to do anything creative. They're playing it safe with the levels. There isn't a lot of variety going on either. Not only that, but you have to play through the levels twice per playthrough. They recycle the entire game 12 missions in, where, okay, 12 missions in, you change characters, so you no longer play as this new guy, you play as Dante, but you have to go back through the entire game and backtrack every mission. So, there's no real excuse for AAA games to do that. Not only that, but you have to replay every boss 3 times. This may have been acceptable when the game is a cheap PS2 title, but things have moved on by now at this point, especially after DMC3. However, I must say, Dante is great fun to play as in this one. However, something about 3's combat is a tad more satisfying, and it just feels like the sword combat is a lot more hard hitting, it's a bit more satisfying and a bit more crunchy, I think is the word I'm looking for. Another cool thing is that the styles that were brought over from DMC3 are back. These alter how Dante controls depending on your playstyle. You can enhance how he shoots, how he swings his sword, how he evades, and even how he blocks. You unlock more throughout the game too. Well, you do in the third game, but we'll get onto that. I personally like Trickster, as I liked having a dedicated button for evasion instead of having to lock on and end up jumping around like a maniac most of the time. In this game, you can actually switch between the styles on the fly, where the other game you kind of had to go into the statue where you upgrade your stuff to change it up. The combat in this one was pretty easy on normal difficulty, actually, especially when you compare it to 3. Yeah, basically the only reason people struggle with this one is when you compare it to the much superior third game. We will get onto that, don't worry. If you have the special edition, which is on PS4 and Xbox One, or the PC version, which I believe also has the special edition actually, then you'll have Legendary Dark Knight mode as well. But as a starting mode, that mode is a bit too hard, especially if you're a newcomer, because even with the overpowered new characters in the special edition, when you start out, you'll be a bit basic and underpowered. Legendary Dark Knight mode being this crazy mode that features about 10 times the amount of enemies on screen at once, and it can get very hectic, although the enemies are scaled for hard difficulty, as I said. Also, one thing I noticed towards the end of my playthrough of 4 is that the red walls don't actually reach out and attack you, unlike the other games. Which, I don't know, just small things add up to make this a completely unsuperior game when you talk about the other games. Yeah, they added in Virgil from DMC3 and also Lady and Trish, which means you have to play the game 3 times to get the different movesets, which means you're fighting the same boss 9 times, and you're playing through the level 6 times, and it can get even more tedious, even though the movesets are different. Virgil and Trish are also extremely overpowered, even early on. Trish you don't get until, well, the same point where you would unlock Dante in a regular playthrough. So at that point you can kind of upgrade her, but even at that point she's just insanely overpowered. And she's not even that memorable to play as, to be honest. I think they just added her for the sake of adding her. Virgil is not powerful enough to take Legendary Dark Knight mode starting up with, even though he can get quite powerful later. That definitely feels like a New Game Plus mode, to be honest. Overall, 4 is great combat, and it is a fun game, even though you'll find the levels pretty crap and pretty dull to navigate at times. And honestly, the game, it's either too easy at first or too hard at first. Story's a bit rubbish as well. I couldn't really tell you what goes on with that. I don't know, I just thought it was pretty boring. At number 2, we've got Devil May Cry 1. This was actually my personal preferred game for a while. However, it lost the spot for reasons I will explain in a bit. Devil May Cry 1 is absolutely brilliant. Fun fact, this was originally a concept for Resident Evil 4, but they ended up making it competent enough to become its own game, and also because, despite how Resident Evil 5 and 6 turned out, they thought that the game was a bit too action focused. Yeah, I know. Anyway, Devil May Cry 1 it's not the most sophisticated game, it's not the fanciest game, it's not content filled or mechanically advanced. However, it has that early PS2 game charm, and it has that feeling of simplicity that is honestly extremely charming and will make you want to replay the game multiple times, which I have done. I've beaten the game about 10 times now. It's short, only been about 3 hours, maybe 4 or 5 on your first playthrough, just depending on how quickly you grasp the combat. The game is actually quite hard, and there is a sudden difficulty increase a couple of missions in where you have to fight a boss, then a really hard sub-boss, then another boss, then that really hard sub-boss again, this time with a timer, followed by another really hard sub-boss. All of this happening in about 10 minutes. That is if you don't die multiple times to the first sub-boss, who's arguably harder than the main bosses due to how aggressive it is. And occasionally the first boss will come back and you'll have to run away from it. If you get past all of that, it will be smooth sailing from there. The game isn't too confusing or illogical with its puzzles and navigation as well, which I like. And the combat is challenging, claustrophobic and exciting because of the difficulty. The game is still fair, even with all of that. And the game will supply you with plenty of healing items if you do well. The punishments for death are harsh, but if you get a hang of how the evasion and combat works, you will be fine. The story is rather simple, but it is compelling enough to make you want to play through the whole game. The music is pretty badass as well, and overall there is nothing really to dislike here in this game. I would say that the game will age for some, But as I said, I reckon the simplicity of everything will make the game hold up even after playing through 3 and 4. Also, the game's atmosphere is actually quite creepy. It will feel a bit like the early stages of Resident Evil 4 at first, which of course is a good thing. Don't get me wrong, it won't give you nightmares or anything, but it is there and it is noticeable. This is definitely the one to play first. Really, the only problem with this game is the final boss requires a really annoying shoot 'em up section, which is extremely frustrating if you are on hard mode, which is also New Game Plus. I'm gonna be honest, I haven't tried Dante Must Die mode. I did beat the game on hard, however, because I don't have the patience with myself to be able to beat the whole game without getting hit once. Finally, at number 1, we have Devil May Cry 3, which would be second place if it weren't for the fact that I replayed the games now, that I am a bit older and wiser than I was originally, and I prefer this one. I had not played this game for a couple of years because there were a few things that bugged me about it originally that we will get into later. Overall though, this one has the best combat and the most balanced difficulty, and also it's pretty impressive that they messed up 2 quite badly and then picked themselves right up with the 3rd game. You now have styles introduced which are in this one, which I spoke about earlier, which obviously added a lot to the combat, including customization in your playstyle. You also have multiple guns and weapons as well, which also have multiple movesets. Also, I don't really know if there's a term for these types of games, but basically most of the game takes place in this giant tower, which is basically almost all explorable throughout most of the game, even if your objectives are broken up with missions. The tower also changes throughout the game, and you return to places you return to visited locations later in the game, which have now been destroyed or changed and affected by the fact that the tower is changing. I really don't know if there's a term for that. I want to call it sort of like another example of a game like that. I believe it's BioShock, and also Prey was a bit like that. But I want to say it's sort of like Die Hard style games, but there's got to be a more technical term for it, because I want to be able to Google it and play more games like this, because I absolutely dig the hell out of that. Because these types of games are so fun. You actually feel appropriately powered for most of the game as well, unlike DMC4. You actually start out with decent amount of moves, and it is possible to get triple S rankings early on. You get a second weapon and a second gun only a couple of missions in as well, which you can seamlessly switch between and make your combos crazy. Seriously, if you watch videos of people playing this game on Dante Must Die mode with no hits, they are absolutely bonkers with their combos, and they get triple S rankings in about 3 seconds. That's just absurd. It's brilliant. But yeah, overall 3 is definitely the best in the series, and while Dante is arguably better in DMC4 because of the seamless style switching, but that's the only thing that's better in 4. Other than that, its weapons and combat are the most fun in this. The game's atmosphere is also excellent, just like in the first game, and honestly feels like the attack landings are a lot more satisfying in this one compared to the other games. The story, while still being simplistic, is still enjoyable for what it is and gives you enough context to get what is going on, and enough for you to be able to enjoy Dante as a character. I personally really like the music in this one as well, and it honestly would fit any kind of action game like this. Really, the only thing I didn't like about this game was some of the bosses only let you do damage after a bit of waiting, which kills the pace for me at least. The Bat Lady in the chariot can piss right off as far as I'm concerned. There is 1 or 2 annoying platform sections in the game, which also bugged me. But really the main thing I remember having trouble with was the navigation and trying to figure out what to do next. That wasn't a problem this time around, whether I subconsciously remembered where everything was, or I don't know, it wasn't a problem with this. Also, there's a bit at the end of the game which involves rotating the architecture of this tower, which changes the room layout. I just recall really struggling with that and getting frustrated, which made me prefer the first game. But upon replaying this game, as I said, I just managed to do it without having to look up anything. I don't know whether or not I just subconsciously remembered everything, or whether or not I just became older and smarter and more intelligent. But I was able to do it, and it wasn't an issue with me. Therefore, because those problems that I originally had are no longer a problem, I can say Devil May Cry 3 is now my favourite in the series. I recently read that Hideki Kamiya was actually interested in remaking the first game. If he uses the combat from 4, but makes the sword combat a tad crunchier, then I will be buying that on day 1, and beating it in one sitting, because the game probably won't be that long. Mind you, I'll probably do that anyway. I think at this point I will buy anything Devil May Cry. I did actually like using him in Marvel vs. Capcom when I tried that game out. It's just a shame I don't particularly enjoy MVC's combat that much. It's just not my thing. But anyway, that's about it for this video. Thank you very much for watching. Hopefully this one will be a bit less controversial and disagreed with compared to the Yakuza video. I plan on doing more of these, to be honest, as people seem to like them and they're a lot of fun to make, even though I suck at reading a script. Anyway, that's about it. Thank you very much. I will see you soon.